Talk Station 630 K-How.
Well, good morning. It's 6:07. It's Wednesday. It's the day after millions of Americans watched a multi-hour broadcast on every major network of the funeral of a man that until a couple of weeks ago almost nobody had heard of, and now the whole world knows his name, a concept that actually came up quite a bit in the funeral ceremony remembrance of George Floyd yesterday. And before I dig into that a little more, let me just say one thing quickly. I've seen so many news stories in the past 24 or 48 hours about really senior people in their line of work, as well as some not so senior people in their line of work. And particularly, we're talking about in news media and entertainment media, because those are the folks kind of more likely to have something about them make the news. I've seen so many people get fired. TV shows canceled, movies canceled, all kinds of things canceled as part of this cancel culture that we live in now, because they said something slightly wrong. Maybe more than slightly, some of them, but most of the stories I've seen slightly wrong or simply not wrong, but outside of the range of opinions that is permitted these days. And in a way, as a radio show host, even though I believe that almost everybody who listens to me knows and has known for years where my heart is when it comes to issues of justice and equality, it's still quite difficult to sit here and almost be afraid to talk. You know, you got to be careful about everything you say, and I think that's too bad. And I hope that over time, as the nation works through whatever it is that we are now, I hope, working through at a more rapid pace than we've been working through it before, I hope that one of the things that comes to pass is some pushback on the people who, for all their talk of tolerance and diversity, are the most intolerant people you'll ever meet. And I'm actually not talking about politicians. I'm talking more about academics and the young adults whose minds those academics have ruined. And I do hope that we get to a position where somebody can make a mistake, an honest mistake, and not lose everything that's important to him or her at that moment because of that mistake. That's my hope. All right, so with that, I'm going to continue here. When I started watching the broadcast of the George Floyd funeral yesterday, part of me thought, gosh, I've heard a lot of coverage of this one guy, and I know the story, and I know that he was murdered, and I know that things need to change. Even though I also believe that, to a certain degree, the systemic sense of the kind of thing that happened to George Floyd is probably overstated. It's definitely real. We saw it on video. We've heard other stories just recently. I just recently in the news, I read about at least 2, maybe 3 other guys who were killed by police in the same way. Overly aggressive restraint while the guy was on the ground already. what happens. But my thought going into the ceremony, the funeral, I'm not even sure what to call it, the remembrance, was I'm a little tired of this story. I've heard a lot already. I'm already on board with reform. But maybe because it was on every channel, although to be fair, I actually didn't try to change a channel, I left it on. I just thought, all right, I'll check this out for a little bit. And this ceremony was held at a big church in Houston. Primarily black audience, primarily black congregation at that church, normally. And I just thought, you know what, I'll just check out a little more. It's a big deal, what's going on. And what I ended up watching, and I saw a lot of it and heard almost all of it. I kept the TV on at high volume while I was moving around the house doing other things during the day so I could hear all of it. I even listened to Al Sharpton, and he said one or two things that I agreed with. I don't know if I've ever said that before. But what I experienced there yesterday, and I don't know if you had the same kind of experience, was really a remarkable event. It was an incredible combination of sad and uplifting, spiritual and artistic, painful and beautiful. I'm not even Christian, much less a black Christian, so I have no personal experience being in a black church, watching the kind of church service that African Americans often enjoy. Now, I don't assume that yesterday's service was a typical service, obviously. But still, the way people spoke and I know this is going to sound like a small thing on a day where we're talking about someone having been murdered and all that's come of that, the singing in the service was just beautiful, incredible. So much talent. Again, not really the point, but I thought I would mention it. It did kind of keep me glued to the broadcast. And it was also remarkable to hear some of the folks who spoke. A lot of people spoke. Family, a couple of politicians, pastors and preachers. And there was, as you might have expected, a wide range of things to say. Not too much of it was political. I guess not surprisingly, the couple of times that the president was mentioned, it wasn't in a positive way, but he wasn't mentioned often. It wasn't really so much about that. It was a little more forward-looking. What are we going to do next? What is this all about? And I want to share with you a little audio. One of the really compelling speakers yesterday, a guy named Bill Lawson, a reverend who was involved in the civil rights marches with Martin Luther King Jr., a distinguished elderly gentleman who spoke from a wheelchair, spoke at length without notes or anything. Clearly he's done that before. And I wanted to share a little of that with you.
You think something good can't come out of this? His death did not simply start a bunch of good speeches, a bunch of tributes. Out of his death has come a movement, a worldwide movement.
He continued on there with what he hopes the movement will look like and what he hopes the movement will be. And before I get back to some more of that audio, just a couple of my own thoughts on a worldwide movement and how it can happen and what it can mean and what I think it needs to be. I'm just one guy. I'm not telling you what you need to think, but I've been thinking about it just like everybody has because there hasn't been that much else to think about in recent days. This has pushed the virus out of the news, and a lot of people still working from home or not back to work at all. This has been a major thing to think about. And I touched on this a few days ago. I think it's really important, and I've been trying to formulate it in my own mind. There's been, I think, an obvious certain resistance among white people to react to what happened to George Floyd in the same way that black people have. And in that statement, I don't mean all white people, nor do I mean all black people, although I suppose there's probably, I'm guessing again, more uniformity of response among African Americans than among whites, especially among whites over the age of, 30 or 35. And I think part of the reason that there is often a hesitancy to go along with calls for major reform is that so often that it feels that those who are calling for reform or revolution or defunding the police, or more rational things than defunding the police, start the conversation or have obvious allies who jump into the conversation by calling everybody who isn't already an activist or already on board, or everybody who had the apparent misfortune to be born white, by calling them /us/me racist without knowing them, us, me. And that is no way to start a conversation when you are trying to get people on board with you to make an important difference for the country. I guess one parallel is that a movement to effect reform in a nation can be boosted by protest. I like protest, but it's not boosted by rioting and looting. And people will be forgiven, people who, let's say, don't live in urban inner cities and don't know much about the daily life of African Americans, will be forgiven for wondering whether the looters and the protesters are really the same people or not. I think they're mostly not. Maybe a few, there was some crossover, but I think they're mostly not. But when you have that kind of scene, and you see people destroying their own neighborhoods, other people's neighborhoods, stealing things, that kind of thing, using the protest, the legitimate protest, as cover for just overt criminality, it's easy to see how that could turn people of goodwill off from wanting to partner with those who were talking about reform at that time. But here's my exhortation to people who are a little bit like me. We're all different in our own ways, right? But when I say a little bit like me, I mean middle-class white person, not a leftist, with not very much experience in how so many African Americans live their daily lives. I mean, really, I've probably spent more time in talking to people in what we might call ghettos in other countries, like in South Africa, than in the United States of America. Right? I've spent time in Soweto, a place that would make a lot of American ghettos look luxurious. As I think about it now, maybe it would do me good to find what some people might call a rough neighborhood and get over there and just talk to some people and learn a little more about what their daily life is like and learn a little more about their experiences that color how they view our society and law enforcement and politics and so many other things. But as I end the end of this segment, I want to make one other very important point. Americans, and frankly, especially Republicans, must stand up for the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and fundamental principles on which this country is based. That justice is blind, equal justice for all, equal treatment of the law to all people. And I don't think we have that right now. Not everywhere, not all the time. And regardless of a person's color or background, for a conservative or a libertarian, I think in all of our minds, we should think that if our country doesn't hold that same promise of protection of the Constitution to all people equally, then we're failing as a nation, and we're better than that.
This is Denver's Talk Station with Ross Kaminsky now. Tom Martino at 10, 630 KA.